Are you thinking about selling all your full frame gear and switching to the Fujifilm X-T3 for wedding photography? Before you make the switch, watch this video. What's up guys, Reggie B Photo here and welcome back to the channel. For those of you who are new, my name is Reggie Ballesteros and I'm a wedding photographer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Up until September of 2018, I've been shooting weddings with the Nikon D750. But as soon as the X-T3 was announced, I put in my pre-order and completely switched to the Fujifilm X-T3 for wedding photography. I've been shooting exclusively with the Fujifilm X-T3 for all my wedding and engagement shoots for about 7 months now. And I wanted to share with you guys what my experiences are with the camera so far and explain why exactly I made the switch. Just a warning though, Fujifilm fans beware. If you believe that the X-T3 is the perfect camera and is the ultimate full frame killer, then stop watching now. But before I get into everything, a little history first. As far as wedding photography goes, I shot my first weddings in 2013 with the Nikon D600. Then in 2015, I picked up two Nikon D750s and used them as my primary wedding camera. At the time, it had awesome dynamic range, very clean files at high ISO, very good continuous autofocus in low light situations, and back then it was actually one of the smaller full frame cameras that you could get. And even at the time of my switch in 2018, it was still holding it down as my main workhorse camera for wedding photography, despite it being almost 5 years old. On the flip side, I was using Fujifilm for travel, documenting my family, and other personal work since 2014. My first Fujifilm camera being the X100S. In 2016, I picked up an X70 as an everyday pocket camera, but in 2017, I started feeling the itch to be able to try out all the different lenses on the Fujifilm X system. So I sold off my X70 in lieu of an XT20. That led me to purchasing the XT2 out of just pure excess. I started investing in the larger aperture Fujifilm prime lenses, including the 16mm 1.4 and the 56mm 1.2. And at that point, I started accumulating way too much camera gear. I pretty much had two complete camera systems. I wanted to condense down my photography gear down to just one kit so badly, but the XT2's autofocus was just not fast enough or good enough in low light in comparison to the D750 for me to completely switch to the XT2 for wedding photography. And on the flip side, the Nikon D750s just were not reasonable for me to take around as an everyday camera for documenting my family and my kids. It took up way too much room in a bag, and it was a hassle to carry around while trying to simultaneously handle a toddler and an infant at the same time. Neither camera felt like a viable option to do double duty as a personal family camera and a wedding photography camera. And then the X-T3 was announced, and I knew I was able to make it work. It wasn't going to be perfect. It would be passable for me as a wedding photography camera and would retain all the features and all the things that I love about the X-T2 as a personal family camera. So after it was announced, I put in my pre-order for the X-T3 with a local camera shop, and I started listing my Nikon D750 along with my lenses up for sale. I'll be upfront right now. The X-T3 is not going to be the ideal wedding photography camera for most photographers out there, especially if you're currently using a Nikon full-frame camera or a Sony full-frame camera, and you're already used to and rely on the awesome dynamic range, the high ISO performance, and the phenomenal image quality of those full frame sensors. So why exactly did I make the switch to Fujifilm for wedding photography? Well, my reasons aren't the reasons that most wedding photographers switch over to Fujifilm for, which is usually size and weight, the tactile controls, and color science. If I'm talking strictly about my wedding photography, I did not switch over to Fujifilm for its size and weight. On Nikon, I used 4 lenses throughout most of the wedding day, which is the 20mm 1.8, the 28mm 1.4, the 58mm 1.4, and the 105mm 1.4. The total kit weight of two Nikon D750s along with these lenses was 8.5 pounds. So in order to recreate the same type of focal length range as well as to get the best image quality that Fujifilm has to offer, I landed on the following prime lenses: the 12mm Rokinon f2, the 16mm 1.4, the 23mm 1.4, the 35mm 1.4, the 56mm 1.2, and the 90mm f2. And as far as ergonomics go, the smaller camera body along with the heavier 1.4 lenses actually was not ergonomically great on my hands. So if you factor in 2 vertical battery grips along with 2 Fujifilm X-T3s, the total weight actually comes out to be 8.6 pounds for the kit. It's actually a weight increase in comparison to what I carried around for Nikon. And at that point also, adding the grips to the X-T3 didn't make the body that much smaller than the Nikon D750 anymore. The next most popular reason people switch to Fujifilm Fujifilm is for the physical dials and the tactile controls. However, I realized that it was actually slower for me to have to take my left hand and rotate the ISO dial, or take my right hand and change the shutter, instead of just using the front or back command dials. And after adding the vertical battery grip, it's even more awkward because you have to adjust it on this side instead of just holding the lens. So I personally have set up my camera to not have to touch the ISO dial or the shutter speed dial at all, and I use the front command dial to change ISO and the rear command dial to change shutter speed. With that said, I do love and use the aperture ring, and I think that in itself is a very big plus, as I can keep all hands on the camera, change the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed with only having to move my finger for the shutter. But overall, I don't think the control scheme that I have set up personally on my X-T3 is any faster or quicker than how I had to change my exposure settings on the Nikon D750. One of the other more popular reasons that people switch over to Fujifilm for wedding photography is for the color science. I shoot all my photos in RAW and I edit them all in Lightroom, and I actually use my own preset that I took over from the Nikon D750 and ported it to the Fujifilm X-T3 to be able to match seamlessly. So any type of color science advantage for skin tone was actually negated because I made it mimic my previous brand and aesthetic from the preset that I use on the Nikon D750. Okay, so why did I switch over to Fujifilm for wedding photography? There are three main factors, and only two of them are Fujifilm specific. The first is the EVF. So when I was shooting with the Nikon D750, one little shooting quirk that I had was whenever I shot in a controlled situation or did pose portraiture, I actually shot with the camera in live view to help me visualize the light, the depth of field, and to lock in the composition of my shot. This saved me from taking test shots and chimping throughout the whole process of that controlled situation. And since the D750's autofocus and live view was super slow, I would actually use manual focus in those situations. But for those pose shots, those controlled situations, the shots that I was using to make my brand stand apart from other wedding photographers in the area, I was using this clunky live view workflow that was essentially a ghetto EVF. So the EVF was a no-brainer for me, and really the main attractor for me going over to mirrorless, as I could preview exposure, depth of field, and my composition, and still have the full performance of phase detect autofocus at the same time. However, having an EVF is in no way a Fujifilm specific feature. I could have moved over to the Sony system, which had a more mature autofocus system for mirrorless, or I could have moved over to the Nikon Z system and retain all the lenses that I already had. So again, why did I switch over to the Fujifilm X-T3 specifically for wedding photography? One of the main reasons was 100% phase detect autofocus across the whole sensor on a mirrorless camera. And this is important for me because I like to do a lot of low angle and high angle shots where I cannot look through the viewfinder. I also like to have my subjects and compositions sometimes go over to the extreme corners of the frame. So being able to hold my camera really down low using the live view from the EVF and be able to track a subject walk across the frame from edge to edge was really attractive to me. It's allowed me to execute shots that I previously wouldn't even have attempted on the Nikon D750 because I didn't trust being able to either blind fire and shoot with the camera real low, or to trust that the contrast autofocus on the Nikon D750 was able to keep up with the moving subject. And the final reason for my switch was I wanted to condense down my camera systems just down to one system, to do it all between personal and family documentary and wedding photography. And I was ready to make this switch now because the X-T3 had autofocus that was at least on par, if not just a little bit behind the Nikon D750, but it was definitely better than the Fujifilm X-T2. And as I mentioned before, the Nikon D750 wasn't going to cut it on like a Disneyland trip or a vacation. While size and weight didn't really play a huge role in the deciding factor to switch over for wedding photography, the X-T3 gives me the flexibility to make the camera smaller when I want it to be, as I do own some of the compact Fujifilm lenses, including the 18mm f2 and the 35mm f2. The X-T3 can be small when I want it to be, and it can also be larger and more ergonomic with better performing glass when I want it to be. The Nikon D750 didn't have a way for me to kind of shrink it down when I needed to be more inconspicuous and lighter. There was also the added side benefit that the camera that I use every day was also going to be the same camera that I use during professional gigs, shoots, and portrait sessions. I found that when I was shooting with the X-T2 every day for documenting my family, I would actually not use the D750 other than a couple times every month. And at that point, my muscle memory was used to the controls of the Fujifilm X-T2, that on the professional gig, I actually had to spend 5 to 10 minutes to kind of like reorient myself to not having an EVF and to the controls that the Nikon D750 had as far as the button layout. Being able to use the same camera and practice with the same camera every day and come out to a wedding day and operate that camera like it's the back of my hand, that really helps for how quickly and how organically I create and visualize photos using the Fujifilm X-T3. It reflects in better, more compelling images, not specifically because of the image quality itself or the performance of the camera, but because I'm just very, very familiar with the tool that I'm using. So now onto my pain points and transition experience. I'll be the first to admit that the X-T3 is just not as easy of a camera to use for wedding photography as the Nikon D750 is. The D750 has a little bit faster and more reliable autofocus, especially in lower light situations. It has more flexibility in the RAW files, better low light capabilities, and cleaner high ISO files, and it has better battery life. So my transition was not super quick or easy. The only thing that I was really familiar with was the control scheme, because the X-T3 pretty much had the same controls. But aside from that, as far as image quality goes, choosing the exposure settings when I'm shooting, and even just how I edit the RAW files in Lightroom, I had to make a lot of adjustments to my photography style and my editing workflow in order to incorporate this camera as an integral part of my wedding photography workflow. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit of how that transition went. So as far as sharpening goes, the camera suffers from over sharpening and this worm effect. When you sharpen the Fujifilm RAW files, due to the demosaicing of the X-Trans sensor, as well as the fact that the camera doesn't have an anti-aliasing filter, it's really easy to get unwanted artifacts, sometimes in these weird worm shapes, especially in the smaller details of the photo. You can't really use whatever sharpening settings you're using on the camera prior to when you switch. You have to find your own Fujifilm specific sharpening settings to match the camera that you have. Something that took me a couple of months to kind of land on the final sharpening settings that I like to use. If you want to know how I sharpen my Fujifilm RAW files in Lightroom, check out my video up above or link down in the description below. Now onto the high ISO. The image quality of the higher ISO files just has a lot more noise than what I was used to on the Nikon full frame system. And this is to be expected because it's just physics coming from a larger sensor to a smaller sensor. On the Fujifilm X-T3, you can already start to see noise in your files at ISO 1600 and above, whereas on the Nikons, it really started to show itself kind of at ISO 6400 or so. Again, this noise phenomenon is not something wrong with the Fujifilm X-T3, as it has some of the best low light performance and high ISO performance for a crop camera. When it comes to comparing the Fujifilm files to Nikon full frame and Sony full frame, who pretty much lead the industry in very clean and phenomenal image quality at high ISO, you can't really expect the Fujifilm files to match it because physics is physics. The larger pixel size of the full frame sensors are by default going to create cleaner images than the smaller pixels on the Fujifilm crop sensor. This is a really important aspect that you have to accept before making the switch over to Fujifilm. And the truth is, the image quality of any modern day camera is more than enough for most photographers. The only difference is if you're spoiled and coming from the Nikon and Sony system, you have to be honest with yourself if you're going to miss that image quality, or if you're the type of photographer that just always knew that the quality was too much and you can settle for whatever the Fujifilm quality is and just accept that as good enough. In order to combat this issue, I've leveraged the EVF as well as the in-camera histogram to be able to expose my high ISO files properly. Particularly if you make the brightest part of the frame the subject, this minimizes how noticeable the high ISO noise is because it's going to be in the darker part of the background. But you know, the combination of worse ISO performance along with the EVF is actually really a blessing in disguise for me, as it's made me a better photographer in seeing and recognizing light in every scene that I encountered. It's allowed me to recognize the direction and the quality of the light, which is equally important to just seeing the light sources. And it's also enabled me to add better quality light to a scene when necessary. So another topic is dynamic range. On the Nikons, I was very used to exposing all my photos by at least one stop, sometimes even a stop and a half, in order to retain the highlights with the intention of pushing back the exposure in post-processing in Lightroom. There was never any real noticeable noise that was added to the file when I did this. In the beginning, for my first couple of shoots with the Fuji X-T3, I was still using this habit, if you will, and I was immediately punished and frustrated when I imported the files into Lightroom and realized that pushing back the exposure in post was actually introducing a lot more noise than I wanted to. In those situations, if I had known that would already happen, I would have just raised the ISO instead, as that seems to yield better results. I will say that the Fujifilm X-T3 does have good usable dynamic range at the base ISO of the camera, usually around 2 to 3 stops, and still retaining a clean file. But once you get to the higher ISOs, say 800 and above, you really should not be underexposing your Fuji files. Because of this, I had to shift my way of shooting and start exposing to the right. Aside from intentionally creating silhouettes, I actually don't underexpose my images on purpose anymore. With that said, there are two things that I've done to be able to counteract this lack of dynamic range in comparison to the Nikon D750. Because the EVF is showing you a preview of the photo in real time, I've actually set up the EVF to have the blinking highlight warnings, so I know exactly what's going to be overexposed before I take the shot. If the dynamic range of the scene that I'm shooting is more than what the XT3 can handle, at least I know exactly what I'm going to be sacrificing, and I can make sure that it's something that I can live with. And another thing that you can do is the in-camera bracketing, since you can bracket the image at 11 frames per second with just one button press. I have it set to shoot 3 stops underexposed and 3 stops overexposed for a total of 7 images in just one 11 frame per second burst, which looks like this. That way I can shoot the moment very quickly and go back in post later to pick out which one actually retained the most amount of detail. Alright, now for autofocus. The autofocus on the XT3 just isn't quite there as far as the continuous autofocus is on the Nikon D750. In good light, sometimes it's about the same, but in a backlight situation, it's actually a lot more huntier. And in lower light situations, it does seem to lag a lot more. I never really noticed any problems with the D750's autofocus in the continuous setting. But on the Fujifilm X-T3, it does work, and at this point, it's good enough for me. And to my surprise, the AFS, or the single shot, is actually a lot better in low light than in comparison to the Nikon D750. It just locks more confidently both in good light and in low light. For the most part, on a wedding day, there's not really too many fast moving situations, and on portrait sessions and engagement shoots, I don't really have that much fast action at all. So having this really great AFS on the X-T3 actually counterbalances the lack of continuous autofocus performance a lot. One other thing to note is that since I moved over to the mirrorless system, I no longer have to calibrate the autofocus on any of my DSLR lenses. On the Nikon D750 with the full frame sensor and the really large aperture shallow depth of field lenses, I personally wanted to calibrate and fine tune the AF on all of my lenses to each of the camera bodies that I owned. It was just way too long a process and took sometimes 1 to 2 hours. So mirrorless has allowed me to simplify my workflow as far as gear maintenance and calibration goes. So now onto the menus, the controls, and the customization of the cameras themselves. So while the X-T3 does have a lot of customization that you can do with the function buttons, the Q menu, the My menu, and all the tactile knobs and dials and stuff, one thing that I really feel that the X-T3 lack is a user control setting like on Nikon and Sony, the U1, U2, U3 custom setting banks. While yes, the Fujifilm system does have a custom setting bank, it's only saved for just your film simulation along with the highlight, shadow, and sharpening tweaks that you do. It really doesn't save anything as far as autofocus settings or video codecs or your control scheme or anything like that. I feel like if you expand these custom setting banks to include, say, everything that you can include on the Q menu, this would really open up the functionality of these cameras to kind of on the fly change for different shooting situations. For example, if I can have a custom setting bank that would save autofocus, controls, and all that stuff, in addition, I would have one setup for when I use off-camera flash. I would have one setup for when I drag the shutter in the reception room or when I'm just shooting portrait sessions. This could just be a firmware fix away. I hope someone at Fujifilm is listening to my video and implements that on a next update in the future. So in regards to battery life, this is one minor adjustment I had to make. Because the sensor is always enabled through either the EVF or the LCD screen, of course the battery life is not going to be as good. It makes sense, and I don't blame the technology at all. But for me, when I was on Nikon, I was carrying 5 batteries and it would last me pretty much the entire day with just 2 to 3 batteries. With the Fujifilm cameras, I bring 10 batteries and I use about 6 batteries across 2 different bodies for an 8-hour wedding. And this gets me around 3,000 to 4,000 shots. If you take into account using a vertical battery grip, this really isn't an issue and you don't have to swap any batteries out. But my biggest issue was really just finding a way to be able to charge 10 batteries the night before without having to babysit and swap them out. So I actually came up with this crazy system using a 5-port USB charger and connecting 5 different dual battery chargers to it. Now that we talked about all that, who is this camera for? Now that I am actually familiar with weddings, I feel like moving on to the Fujifilm system and taking away some of the technological advantages of my camera system is actually a great next step for me as a wedding photographer. So I'm giving up a few luxuries. One is shallow depth of field. and just like this extreme flexibility in dynamic range and high ISO that made me a little bit lazier in choosing the ultimate correct settings for each situation. Having the crop sensor has forced me to really pay attention to what's in the background of my subject and really frame them properly without any distracting elements behind their heads, because the depth of field is not going to save me for the shot. Overall, the X-T3 has forced me to fine-tune my lighting skills and just make me make more sound photography decisions. If you're a wedding photographer that requires every single bit of contingency, safety, backup, flexibility, you name it, on the wedding day, and you want to have the cleanest high ISO files as possible, the Fujifilm system or the X-T3 is not going to be the camera for you, especially if you're already used to using a full frame Nikon camera or a full frame Sony camera. You're always going to be in this constant cycle of comparing the files to what you could have got on your Nikon or Sony camera. The only photographers who should switch over to the Fujifilm system from a full frame are the photographers who have the correct expectations in mind, and maybe they really want the weight savings or the color science or the controls over kind of like the importance of image quality. Like, image quality is good enough for them and they're not striving for the best leading in the industry quality files. This camera can give you professional high quality files. It's just not going to be as forgiving of a camera when it comes to missing the exposure settings, so you have to nail the shot. If you're on the fence in between, if you think the image quality is going to be enough, my best recommendation is just rent the camera and shoot it alongside with your full frame gear before you end up selling. That way you can see and understand if you can live with the image quality difference. If you're just a hobbyist and you want to document your family or your travel or just start learning photography, X-T3 is more than enough, and actually you might even be able to get away with just starting with the X-T30 in the beginning, which has the same sensor, a little bit less controls, but is more than enough for the beginner to learn on. If you're not too accustomed to expecting the same type of dynamic range or image quality coming from the likes of the Nikon D850 or the A7 III or the A9 or the A7R3, this could be the camera for you. I just wanted to make sure that I give you a big dose of reality before you kind of like make the jump. It may be the better camera for specific photographers like me who wanted something very specific outside of the wedding photography world, but you really have to take into account the personal preferences of each photographer and each individual. For me, I'm accepting all the weaknesses of the X-T3 and I'm capitalizing on the strengths that it has and adjusting the way that I shoot and edit in order to accentuate things that it does well. And again, for me, the main reason for my switch has and always will be to be able to have one camera to rule it all, to be able to use the same camera every day for personal situations and for weddings. And I'm hoping what I've shared with you guys today will help you make the decision of whether or not you should switch from your full frame system over to the X-T3 for wedding photography or just for photography in general. If you do decide to make the jump, I have a playlist linked up above and down below for everything that I've created relating to the Fujifilm X-T3. I also have editing videos to help you with that editing transition if you're a Lightroom user. So now I turn it to you guys. What factors made you guys switch to the Fujifilm system, or specifically the Fujifilm X-T3 for wedding photography or for the photography that you do? If you decided to not make the jump or you tried it out and it didn't work for you, what factors made you not really settle with the X-T3 or Fujifilm? That way we can kind of let everyone know down in the comments the reality and the experiences that everyone has had. And as always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'm making a new Fujifilm or photography video every single week. If you want to see more of my photography work, follow me on Instagram at ReggieBPhoto for a new post every single day. Alright guys, that's it for me. Make sure to get out, go shoot, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.